Welcome to Voices United, a congregational song podcast. I am your host, Ben Brody, and in this episode, my guest is Constance Cerry. Constance is professor of Christian worship and pastoral ministry at Indiana Wesleyan University and the author of several books on worship. Constance and I met in January 2019 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Constance, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Could you share a little bit about your earliest memories of hymns and congregational singing? And then how did you come to understand your vocation as a scholar of Christian worship?
I grew up in the church. My dad's a pastor. And in our small congregation of about, I'd say, 100 people, congregational song was a very important part of the service. And I grew up in the United Brethren Church, which is a very small denomination. It sounds like it's an Anabaptist group, and it isn't. It's just a small, generic, kind of evangelical group. And we had our hymnal, and singing was a big part of the service. And I loved to hear the songs and loved the singing. And I have two early memories that are precious to me. The first is I would have been in about the third grade, and I didn't know how to read a hymn in the sense of stanza form and how the lines moved down the staffs and so forth. And I can remember, I have a vivid memory of a high schooler named Sandy sitting with me in church. I can still picture where we were. And she was holding the hymnal for me or with me. We were sharing a hymnal. And I could read, of course, but I didn't know the format of the page, how that worked. And I can remember, as we were singing a song, she took my finger, my pointer finger, and held it and moved the pointer finger through the staves of music, and then back to the second stanza and so forth. And, instantly, of course, I could use the hymnal effectively and read a hymn. I have that memory. I have also a memory, this was a little bit later, but when my grandmother died, she lived in Virginia all her life, and she was a part of the United Brethren Church, and the funeral was in her small rural church, and we had a very large family, and we were all gathered in the basement. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of family members, and we were gathered in the basement awaiting the service to begin. And whenever the prelude had concluded, the funeral director would usher us up into the special seating in the church. And we were waiting for her funeral, and I can remember it being quiet, and I can also remember somebody just began to sing. And they sang, "My Jesus, I love thee, I know thou art mine." And as soon as they started singing, the entire family picked it up in parts, a cappella, and sang the entire hymn, all the stanzas that we knew from our hymnal, from memory. And I have just a rich memory of that. And so those are some of this, a little bit about my background. As far as how I entered into the scholarship of Christian worship, I have to tell you I didn't have a life plan. I would say that I didn't find it, but it found me. And when I was a senior in college, at Huntington College, I experienced a call to ministry, a vocational ministry, full-time ministry. And I understood that to mean that God was asking me to serve the church full-time for my life. What form that would take, I didn't know, but I was a music major. And so I thought that made sense for me to enter into full-time church music in the life of the church, which I did, and did for almost 2 decades. But along the way, I was invited to teach as an adjunct at some Christian seminaries and universities in the area where I was located. And then people began to approach me about entertaining the idea of pursuing the academy. At the same time, there was a genuinely a call toward pastoral ministry at the same time. That was something I had to wrestle down with. I wasn't sure what was going on with the kind of dual pull, and the short answer to that is that I came to understand that the call to ministry isn't to a function, but it is to Christ and His church. Mm-hmm. And so that it was God's prerogative to develop in me, according to giftedness and needs of the community and so forth, ways to place me and use me in different ways than I had anticipated. So I don't think of my call as having changed, but the way that I'm living out that call did take a turn mid-career. And so in the course of things, I pursued both ordination, Master of Divinity required in my denomination for ordination, and then a terminal degree in worship where I studied with Robert Weber, and then that at Northern Seminary. And he actually became the director of my doctoral thesis. He was assigned to me, and that started a relationship and really started a trajectory toward worship scholarship.
Oh, that's great. Some of your scholarship is focused on how to choose good songs or hymns for worship. I realize this is a question that you've written a whole book about, but what makes a good song for worship?
Well, I think it's multidimensional. I think it has to have a good message, and by that I mean that the song itself contributes to the story of God. So to me, a good congregational song of any style, of any type, of any size, has to make some contribution, I should say, in the liturgy to the narrative of God's story. And of course that takes place over time and in little snippets, but that you could sense that is a part of what God, by God's story, in the most general sense, I think of that as all that God has done, is doing, and will do, creation, incarnation, recreation. So some sort of a link to that. So a good message. I think it also has to have a shared communal perspective. Not that everyone disagrees with or agrees with every word in the song, but that there's some sense of ownership by the community in which it's sung, in the context. And sometimes I talk about that as one's worship voice. And it's not style, but it's the composite dimensions of the group that's singing it. So a good message, a communal perspective. I think craft is important. I think absolutely the music and the lyrics and other artistic forms that are involved certainly has to be crafted. There has to be diligence and discipline that's brought to bear on that. And that doesn't discount by any means, say, songs from the oral tradition or any aspect of that, because I consider songs from the oral tradition that maybe have survived just about through repetition and through generation to generation. I view those as crafted. Yeah. So I'm not suggesting a Western view of craftsmanship per se, but just due diligence in the artistic creation itself. And then I would say, fourthly, a good liturgical purpose. That I think that we don't really sing just to sing, but we sing to serve the purpose of the liturgy. So those four things, to me, help make up a good song.
You mentioned liturgical purpose. I'm wondering if in your scholarship, and especially in your work with students, and the songs that you've come across, do you find are there certain liturgical purposes that are perhaps undersung or lacking in songs?
Yeah, I think so. Excuse me, without question. This depends somewhat on style and somewhat on tradition, but it can be light on intercessions, intercessory prayer. It can be light on Eucharist. Yeah. It can be light on even the sending. I think it can be heavy on praise. It can be heavy on self-expression. So all of those are viable pieces to the liturgy. Yeah. But I think we would be wise to just assess how the songs are functioning in a balanced way throughout the liturgy, rather than front-loading the liturgy with song sets that are more randomly composed.
Yeah. I know in my work curating the songs for my congregation, when I come across a good sending song, that's gold, because that's often one of the hardest places to find good new material, I think. That's great. I want to ask about one trend I've observed, and as you work with young people as well, I'm guessing you've observed this in recent worship choruses, maybe the last 5 years, maybe longer. I've observed this pattern of, in the bridge, in a verse-chorus bridge format, this sort of octave jump that takes place. And when I've adapted some of these songs for congregational worship, I find it tricky to either I find I'm having to choose to not do that octave jump, or having to set the piece in a key that puts the verses very low. And I'm curious if you've made this observation.
Oh, yeah.
And what, if you have any suggestions for those of us that are trying to figure out how to incorporate these songs well.
Well, I don't know if I have a suggestion, because the range is a complication.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, once you modulate to a lower key or higher key, or technically probably to a lower key, to avoid the unreasonable octave jump, you're already placing it out of the register in other ways. So I don't know if I have an answer. I do think one of the things I try to mention to my students is that often when that's done, it's done because the singer can.
Yeah.
And so as a performer, the worship band that might be introducing or has recorded this worship song is able to do it because they can. So I do talk to my students about we do things because we can, or because we must, or even because we can't. So there's a range of choices. There's some things we can't do, some things we may do, there's some things we must do. And so that bridge thing probably lands in that we may do it, but I don't think we must do it.
Yeah.
And so I just suggest that they go on a case by case basis, and I have been certainly I recently observed this too, where it's very confusing to congregation, because if the leader makes the jump because they can, not because they must, but because they can, then it's the congregation's been thrown off in their singing. They're wondering where to go. They can't go there, and they don't know where to go. So again, I suggest to my students that they really do self-restraint for the sake of the church, not because they're in a position of performance mode, but because the church needs them to moderate that in order to be able to enter in singing. I don't really have an easy answer to that.
It strikes me too that my observation has been in congregational settings, when that's done, often it puts the chorus in a lower, the chorus is maybe the main part of the message that you're wanting to kind of be the high point, but when it's taken down, a third or a fourth to enable that octave jump later in the bridge, it kind of reduces the...
It's counterproductive.
Yeah,
I agree. And I think both male and female voices in the congregation struggle with this then. So if the pitch is lowered, even, say, a soprano voice, like I am most days, not today, but it's too low. Or, nobody can enter in fully. It's a struggle for all voices.
There are certain notes that people are having to just not sing because they can't reach them. Well, thanks. I'm glad to have a chance to...
I can sympathize, but I don't really have an answer.
What do you see as the role of congregational singing in worship? Why is it important?
Well, I think there's sociological reasons that it's important, psychological reasons it's important, liturgical, and so forth. But one of the things that I try to emphasize is that the role of congregational song is to facilitate worship's greater purpose. And so song, I'm speaking exclusively about the gathered community for primary worship service. So that's the context I'm speaking of right now. But if worship has its own purpose, then everything in that service has to support the purpose of the worship service.
Yeah.
It doesn't have its own purpose per se. And so I look at the purpose of worship as to proclaim and celebrate the story of God in Jesus Christ. And so then everything that happens in that service, to me, has to contribute to that mission. The service has a mission. And so I would say that the role of music in worship is to the same mission, to facilitate the proclamation and celebration of the story of God. However, under that, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, so I would say music, congregational song has one role, to proclaim and celebrate the story of God. But under that, it has different functions to help that get done. And so I have been working with this idea, and this is in The Music Architect, that music accompanies the actions of worship. In other words, much of what can be said in worship can be sung in worship. So to sing the acts of worship instead of just speaking them, so in that sense, music accompanies the actions of worship. Secondly, music accommodates the dialogue of worship, and so music facilitates the revelation response dialogue. So part of the decision of a musician or a worship leader is to say, is this congregational song primarily revelation, or is this primarily response? And then to set them in a dialogical way so that the liturgy is carried conversationally because of who God is. And then thirdly, music accomplishes the community of ministry. And here I'm talking about how there's a tri-directional conversation going on. So it's God singing to people, people singing to God, people singing to people. And so it accomplishes, I think music does, the tri-directional nature of song. And I think helping people get that there's this multi-directional conversation going on. So there aren't very many songs that are God singing to us, but there are a few.
Yeah.
And I think about the song that is a wonderful song, I Was There to Hear Your Morning Cry. So that's God singing to us. Singing that is such a realization that God's involved in the song. And then there's lots of us singing to God songs. And of course, I think it's a very important New Testament idea to sing people to people in the sense of exhortation. So I advocate right now for one role, proclaim and celebrate the story of God, but then within that, worship helps functionally get that done by accompanying the actions of worship, accommodating the dialogue of worship, and accomplishing the communal ministry of worship.
That's great. Yeah, and it seems to me that dimension, that in each of those roles of that communal activity, that you're sort of doing that together or feeling that together even in a way as your voices are resonating.
Yeah, that's perhaps the most important piece.
Yeah.
And that's why the volume of worship is a theological issue for me. It's not a technical issue, and it's not a stylistic issue. But anytime the sound of the service overtakes the community's sound, you have taken a step away from a theologically true understanding of what was going on here.
Yeah.
Because the sound of the voices has to be prominent in order to understand worship as a communal event. If they're not heard, it removes the sense of community. So to me, it's not a taste issue or a style issue. It literally is a theological issue. It's the same way for me that lighting in the service is a theological issue. It's not a taste issue. It's not, for me. It's not a style issue. I mean, I know that the darkness of an auditorium / church is implemented intentionally to capture a certain style of worship. But anytime you cannot see the person next to you in worship, then you have stepped away from understanding this is a communal event.
And if the result of that is a greater sense of just this individual engagement with God.
And that's what it produces.
Yeah.
It helps to produce that. I mean, I'm not laying everything at the feet of that, but it doesn't encourage community whatsoever.
Yeah, that's really helpful, I think, thinking about sometimes these maybe more mundane technical issues are all theological issues.
They are. I tell my students, there's precious little about worship studies that isn't theological in nature.
Yeah.
I mean, even the things that we assume are neutral, they are not neutral.
Yeah.
One way or the other.
Thank you. What today is most encouraging to you in the landscape of congregational singing and worship?
To me, the most encouraging thing is cross-cultural song and sharing. Internationally, the abilities that we have to share song is priceless. And so the church owning the wide view of the church in its song, to me, is very exciting. The work of ethnodoxologists and so forth is incredible. We've added a required course in ethnodoxology for all of our worship majors, and we have specialists come and teach it as an intensive. So we have people from the International Council of Ethnodoxologists teach the course. But my students tell me that that's the best course in the curriculum. And there's a lot of appreciation by me and my students, and I just find that whole, the possibilities of that are priceless, so I'm very excited about that.
My observation with students over the last 15 years has been just a greater openness and willingness to try new things and sing in different languages and learn music of that's outside of what they grew up with. And
I agree with
I find that
they're
very
eager.
Yeah.
My students are eager.
Yeah.
They love it.
Yeah, that's great. What today most concerns you in congregational singing and worship?
One of the concerns I have is simply this goes along with what I delight in, but one of my concerns is the widespread adoption of North American music as the standard for Christian music in worship. So that's a concern. Secondly, I think that now this applies largely to contemporary worship, but a high percentage of contemporary music coming from a very small group of record labels, so that there's a certain 4 or 5 go-to labels that are limited in scope, but once they're based on popularity and sales and all that if that becomes your auto default for choices, that it doesn't leave us with this widespread of options of everything. So that would be a concern. And I just think, thirdly, maybe a lack of theological reflection upon congregational song. And it has to happen at 2 levels. I think it has to happen at assessing individual songs. So each song stands on its own merits and has to be assessed. But beyond that, the canon of song has to be assessed. So you're not only assessing adequate, inadequate, but you are assessing the entire range of the corpus of song that your church is singing at any given time to look for healthy balance to what we're being formed with. So if obviously worship music forms us. And so the question is our formation balanced by virtue of the repertoire of our church?
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. Helpful even, considering that there may be a time where, there likely will be times where there's a great song that you just can't use because you already have other great songs that kind of fit that role in the service, and or maybe you need to delay introducing that song for a while. And that's great. What advice would you give to a new worship leader or music director who's choosing songs for worship for the first time?
I would want them to understand that the responsibility that they have for the formation of their people. So to me, that's step one, is to just help people understand that what they choose over time will deeply affect the faith and experience of their people, and that people become what they sing. So I would advise, and I do advise young leaders, emerging leaders all the time, do not choose your songs in isolation. Choose people in your context who represent a variety of sources, so to speak, musical, pastoral, lay, generational, and invite them into the process, because what you will arrive at will be a far better canon of song than if you yourself simply pick the things you know or that you prefer and so forth. So I think just understanding the healthy weight of what is at play here, but also to do it in community and not as a solo leader.
That's great. I find it helpful, additionally, to have I have a handful of maybe untrained musician friends in the congregation who are my sounding boards when I'm introducing something new.
That's very wise.
Because I think when we're up front, we often don't have a good sense of how this piece is being learned, how it's fitting with the congregation, and so sometimes having those few people, trusted voices, to check with.
And that reminds me too, I would tell a young leader, do not be afraid to teach the song to the people, because that tradition has just waned.
Yes.
Now, decades ago, when I was doing my training in church music, we would have an entire course in song leading.
Yeah. And
part of that was how to teach songs to the congregation. And I see that done very little today.
Yeah.
So someone will simply just begin to sing, and then people can't enter in because they don't know it. And the expectation is, well, they'll get it once we do it a few times. But to actually teach a song, I think is a very wonderful and healthy thing to do.
That's great. Well, Constance, I want to close our time together with 5 questions that I ask each person that I interview for this podcast. The first is, which hymn has most shaped your faith?
The old hymn that is in archaic language, If Thou But Suffer God to Guide Thee. It's to me a hymn of surrender and trust. So I've memorized that text and just come back to it. It wasn't really in my United Brethren hymnal. I discovered it later, early in my ministry, but after I had left home, and that one has nurtured me.
That's great. Which hymn do you turn to for comfort?
Be still, my soul. The Lord is on your side.
What is your favorite piece of music?
Well, this is a hard one, but I would have to say O Magnum Mysterium by Morton Lauridsen.
Beautiful piece.
I just go to that, close my eyes, listen repeatedly, and I think it's, of course, a magnificent piece musically, but the irony for me is that the mystery that's the text is about draws me into more mystery.
Yeah.
So I find that to be a stunning piece.
That's great. What book other than the Bible has most shaped your faith or influenced your vocation?
Henry Nouwen's In the Name of Jesus. I love little books that are jewels and deep and profound, but that call to not be spectacular, that call to not be noticed, to not pursue things for your own engagement, but to pursue others, to pursue their call. And so I find that that's a book that can be read over and over again. So that little book, In the Name of Jesus, was very early on. I came upon that, and that really helped set my call into place a bit. I'm not saying I've achieved that or mastered that, but it has situated my personal call to ministry in a certain place that I have to return to and revisit and insist that it must be in the name of Jesus.
Wonderful. Which hymn would you like to have sung at your funeral?
I have a list of songs that I'd like, hymns or songs that I'd like sung at my funeral. Hope it's not imminent, but they're ready. They're in my Bible. But the number one would be "Give Me Jesus." That's my number one song for my funeral.
That's great. Constance, it's been just a joy getting to spend this time with you. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the invitation. I love chatting with you, Ben.
And I should mention, we will look forward to your forthcoming book that is on worship discipleship. When would you expect that to be out?
It's supposed to be released this fall, in October.
All right.
Yeah, 2019.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.
Voices United, a congregational song podcast, is produced by Benjamin Brody with support from the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada and Whitworth University. Special thanks to the Center for Congregational Song for publicity and technical expertise, and Whitworth University alum Lane King for editing and production.